The air in rural Carroll County, Arkansas, held a different kind of cold in November of 1904. It was a damp, invasive chill that clung to the bone, a cold that promised a harsh winter for the scattered homesteads nestled deep within the Ozark Mountains. For Deputy Frank Miller, this particular morning felt colder than most. He'd been riding for nearly 2 hours, the rhythmic plod of his horse's hooves the only sound to break the oppressive silence of the fog-shrouded forest. His destination was a place that had, in just under a year, already become a subject of uneasy whispers and local gossip, the Lawson Inn. It had been 3 days since anyone had seen or heard from its proprietor, Elias Lawson, a man known for his rigid schedule and stark demeanor. A mist supply run into town was unusual. 3 days of silence was unheard of. As the handsome, two-story structure emerged from the mist, Miller felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The inn, meant to be a beacon of civilization on a lonely stretch of road, looked like a tomb. No smoke curled from its chimneys. No light flickered in its windows. It was utterly, unnervingly still. The grand porch, built with proud timber cleared from the surrounding land, seemed to sag under a weight that was not physical. An ornate sign, creaking softly on its hinges, read the Lawson Inn, finest lodging and victuals. The promise felt like a macabre joke. Miller dismounted, his boots sinking into the muddy track. The front door was slightly ajar, a dark, gaping mouth in the face of the building. It was an invitation no sane person would accept. He drew his service revolver, the click of the hammer echoing unnaturally in the dead air. He called out, "Mr. Lawson, Serafina, anyone home?" Only the whisper of the wind through the skeletal branches of the oaks answered. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, and deeply, deeply wrong. Stepping across the threshold of the Lawson Inn was like stepping into a painting where the artist had lost his mind. The interior was dark, the heavy drapes drawn tight against the weak morning light. The air was thick with a cloying, metallic scent that Miller knew instantly. It was the smell of cooled blood, and there was too much of it. The grand lobby, which he'd seen bustling with a handful of travelers just a month prior, was in a state of chilling disarray. A chair was overturned. A kerosene lamp lay shattered on the floorboards, its oil creating a dark, reflective pool. But it was the details that began to crawl under Miller's skin. On the check-in desk, the guest ledger was open to a blank page, as if waiting for a final, phantom visitor. Next to it, a child's porcelain doll lay face down. Miller nudged it with the toe of his boot, his heart pounding against his ribs. He turned it over. Its painted blue eyes had been crudely, violently gouged out, leaving two dark, empty sockets that seemed to stare into eternity. This was not a robbery. This was something else entirely, something personal and horrifying. He moved deeper into the inn, his every footstep a thunderclap in the suffocating silence. The dining room was to his left. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. What he saw in that room would haunt his waking moments and poison his dreams for the rest of his days. It was a scene of such calculated, macabre artistry that it defied all reason. It was not just a crime scene. It was a testament to a profound and disturbing madness. The local whispers about a curse, about the forbidden land the inn was built upon, suddenly felt less like superstitious gossip and more like a dire, unheeded warning. This was a place that had been banned by forces older than the town, older than the state itself, and Elias Lawson in his hubris had trespassed. To understand the horror that befell the Lawson Inn, one must travel back just 18 months, to a time of hope and ambition. Elias Lawson was not a native of the Ozarks. He was a man from St. Louis, with a small inheritance and a grand vision. He saw the rugged, untamed beauty of the Arkansas mountains not as a wilderness to be feared, but as an opportunity to be seized. He was a man of the new century, a man of progress, who believed that nature was a resource to be bent to the will of man. With his wife, Serafina, and their two young children, 8-year-old Lydia and 6-year-old Samuel, he purchased a large, remote tract of land with the dream of building a premier traveler's inn. It was to be a monument to his success, a testament to his foresight. Serafina, a quieter, more pious soul, was less certain. She found the deep woods unsettling, the profound silence between the ancient trees a source of anxiety rather than peace. The locals, a tight-lipped and wary folk, kept their distance. When Elias announced the specific spot he had chosen for his inn, a small, unnaturally flat clearing atop a low hill, a few of the old-timers tried to warn him. They spoke in hushed tones of the land being sour. They mentioned old stories, tales passed down from their grandfathers, of a place the native tribes had shunned for generations, a place where the earth held bad memories. Elias, a man of logic and commerce, scoffed at their primitive folklore. He was not one for ghost stories or curses. He saw only a prime location with a commanding view. The clearing was perfect save for one feature, a strange, circular arrangement of moss-covered stones at its center. They were old, weathered, and seemed to hum with a latent energy that made the hairs on Seraphina's arm stand up. Without a second thought, Elias ordered the stones pried from the earth and cast into the nearby ravine. The foundation of his inn would be laid right where they had stood. The groundbreaking was a violation, a desecration of something he could not and would not understand. The construction of the Lawson Inn was a feat of sheer will. Elias drove himself and his small team of hired laborers with a relentless, almost fanatical energy. He worked from dawn until dusk, his hands blistered, his face grim with determination. He was building more than an inn. He was building a legacy. As the structure rose from the cleared earth, it was undeniably impressive, a two-story testament to modern ambition in a world still clinging to the old ways. But from the very beginning, the project was plagued by a string of strange and unsettling incidents. Tools would vanish from where they were left, only to reappear days later in impossible places. A perfectly healthy pack mule suddenly broke its leg in the dead of night, its terrified whinnies echoing through the valley. The laborers, local men accustomed to the hardships of the frontier, grew increasingly unnerved. They spoke of a feeling of being watched, of cold spots that would drift through the work site even on the warmest days. More than one man quit, forfeiting his pay and walking away without explanation, his face pale with a fear he could not articulate. Seraphina's anxieties deepened. She would often find her children standing at the edge of the woods, staring silently into the shadows as if listening to a conversation she couldn't hear. When she asked what they were doing, young Samuel would simply say, "We're listening to the whispering." Elias, however, remained resolute. He dismissed the accidents as coincidence and the whispers as the imaginings of simple, superstitious minds. He was a man of brick and mortar, of profit and loss. He could not see the darkness seeping into the very timbers he was raising. He was blind to the fact that the sour earth he had disturbed was now beginning to claim its new occupants, marking them as its own. The inn was not just being built upon the land, it was being absorbed by it. The curse was already taking root. In the late summer of 1903, the Lawson Inn officially opened for business. Despite the local unease, its initial success seemed to prove Elias right. The inn's location on a new, more direct route for timber surveyors and traveling merchants meant a steady trickle of guests. For a few brief months, a fragile sense of normalcy settled over the Lawson family. The sounds of conversation and commerce filled the halls, temporarily drowning out the unsettling quiet of the surrounding wilderness. Elias was proud, his stern demeanor softening into something resembling satisfaction. He had stared down the superstitions of the ignorant and had won, but the victory was short-lived. As autumn deepened, turning the vibrant Ozark foliage to shades of rust and blood, the strangeness returned, more potent than before. Guests began to complain. A salesman from Little Rock reported waking in the middle of the night to the distinct sound of a woman weeping, only to find the hallway empty. A geologist and his wife checked out a day early, unnerved by a constant, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from within the walls of their room. A sound they said was like a fingernail scratching on wood, desperate to get out. Seraphina tried to explain these occurrences away as the creaks and groans of a new building settling, but she knew it was a lie. The disturbances were too specific, too personal. She started having terrible nightmares, visions of dark, grasping roots pushing up through the floorboards of her bedroom. She would wake up shivering, her nightgown soaked in a cold sweat, with the unshakable feeling that she was not alone in the room, even as her husband snored beside her. The children, Lydia and Samuel became more withdrawn. They stopped playing outside altogether, preferring to sit in the corner of the lobby, drawing disturbing pictures in a shared sketchbook. Their drawings were always the same: a tall, thin house with no windows, and stick figures with gaping, screaming mouths. The curse of the Lawson Inn was no longer a vague feeling. It was becoming an active, malevolent presence. Elias Lawson's response to the escalating strangeness was not fear, but anger. He saw these events as a personal affront, an attack on his vision and his authority. He couldn't fight shadows or whispers, so he fought the people around him. His temper, always simmering beneath a controlled surface, began to boil over with increasing frequency. He accused the guests of being drunk or lying, creating tense, unpleasant confrontations that drove away potential customers. He berated Serafina for her hysteria, ordering her to pray harder and stop filling the children's heads with nonsense. His face, once handsome and determined, began to take on a gaunt, haunted look. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and a muscle in his jaw twitched incessantly. He began taking long, solitary walks in the woods, returning late at night with mud on his boots and a feverish glint in his eyes. It was during this period that his obsession with the cellar began. The cellar was a damp, stone-lined space, dug directly into the earth where the ancient stone circle had once been. It was cold, smelled of wet soil and decay, and Elias started spending hours down there alone. He forbade anyone else from entering, securing the thick oak door with a heavy iron padlock to which only he held the key. Serafina, her fear for her husband now eclipsing her fear of the house, would stand at the top of the cellar stairs, listening. She could hear him down there, not working but muttering to himself in a low, continuous drone. Sometimes she would hear a strange scraping or tapping sound, but when she would call down to him, she was met with only an enraged, booming silence. The man she had married was vanishing, replaced by a brooding, paranoid stranger who was communing with the darkness beneath their home. The inn was no longer just a business. It had become his fortress, and its cellar, his forbidden sanctuary. By the spring of 1904, the reputation of the Lawson Inn had curdled. The trickle of travelers had all but dried up, replaced by a steady stream of macabre rumors that spread through the county like a fever. People in the nearby town of Eureka Springs spoke of it as the Blighted Inn. They recounted the stories of frightened guests and added their own embellishments. It was said that the water from the well ran black at midnight, that spectral faces could be seen peering from the empty windows. The warnings the locals had given Elias were no longer whispers. They were now spoken as established fact. They said he had angered the land, and the land was now taking its payment. The term the old-timers used for the affliction was a piece of forbidden folklore, a name rarely spoken aloud: the soil's hunger. It was an ancient curse, they claimed, tied to that specific patch of ground. The legend told of a territorial spirit, or perhaps the collective memory of the desecrated land itself, that would slowly poison the minds of those who disturbed it. It didn't just haunt them, it consumed them. It would feed on their ambition, their love, their sanity, until nothing was left but a hollow vessel for its own malevolent will. The ultimate goal of the soil's hunger, the most horrifying part of the legend, was to drive its victim to a final, macabre act, a blood sacrifice to feed the soil and replenish its violated energy. Elias Lawson, the man of progress and logic, was now the central character in a horrifying folk tale he had once mocked. He had become a prisoner in his own creation, isolated by geography and his own burgeoning madness. The inn, once his greatest dream, was now a laboratory for his psychological and spiritual decay. And the curse, the soil's hunger, was tightening its grip, preparing for its final, bloody harvest. As the Lawson family's isolation became absolute, a new and terrifying figure began to populate the children's lives. They called him the Shadow Father. Lydia first mentioned him to her mother one evening, her voice a small, trembling whisper. She said that sometimes, when their real father was locked in the cellar, another father would appear. This one, she said, was taller and his edges were blurry and dark, like smoke in a dark room. He didn't speak with his mouth, but with thoughts that entered her head. He told her disturbing things, that the woods were hungry, that the floorboards were thirsty, that they must be very, very quiet to not wake what slept beneath the house. Samuel confirmed the stories. He said the shadow father smelled like freshly dug earth and cold stone. He would stand in the darkest corners of a room, perfectly still, just watching them with eyes they couldn't see but could feel. Serafina, frantic with terror, confronted Elias. She pleaded with him, telling him the children were seeing things, that the house was driving them all mad. Elias' reaction was not one of concern, but of pure, unadulterated rage. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip like iron, his eyes burning with a cold fire she had never seen before. He accused her of turning his own children against him, of filling their heads with the same superstitious rot as the locals. He dragged her to the children's room and forced them to recant, to say they had made it all up. The fear in their eyes was so profound that they stammered out the lie he demanded. But Serafina knew the truth. The entity the children were seeing was not a ghost in the traditional sense. It was the psychological projection of Elia's own fracturing soul. It was the personification of the curse, the dark part of him that was being fed and nurtured by the house, the part that was now growing stronger than the man himself. In late September of 1904, a man named Dr. Alastair Finch, a botanist and amateur folklorist from Boston, found himself stranded in the Ozarks. His carriage had broken a wheel, and with nightfall approaching, he was directed by a passing farmer to the only lodging for miles, the Lawson Inn. What was meant to be a single night's stay would become the only external record of the family's final descent into madness. Dr. Finch was a man of science, a rationalist by trade, but his academic interest in local legends made him a uniquely perceptive observer. From the moment he arrived, he sensed a profound sickness in the atmosphere. In a leather-bound journal he kept, he documented his experience with meticulous detail. He described Elias Lawson as a man consumed by a palpable paranoia, noting his sunken, watchful eyes and his habit of muttering to himself when he believed no one was listening. He described Serafina as a wraith of a woman, fluttering at the edges of every room as if terrified of casting a shadow. He wrote of the oppressive silence of the inn, a quiet that seemed to have a physical weight. Dr. Finch's scientific curiosity was piqued. He was initially dismissive of the local tales of a curse, but the environment of the inn was so tangibly malevolent that he began to document the strange occurrences. He recorded the faint, scratching sounds from the cellar, the way the children would flinch whenever their father entered a room, and the disturbing, intricate patterns that Lydia was constantly carving into scraps of wood with a small knife, patterns that resembled gnarled roots and screaming faces. His journal, intended as a record of botanical specimens and regional folklore, was rapidly becoming the secret case file of a family being systematically destroyed by an unseen force. He didn't know it at the time, but he was writing the only epitaph the Lawson family would ever truly have. Dr. Finch's stay at the inn extended from one night to 3, then to a full week. He told the Lawsons his carriage repairs were delayed, a lie to satisfy his morbid, academic fascination with the unfolding tragedy. His journal entries from this week grow increasingly frantic. He documented a conversation with young Samuel, who told him that the shadow father had promised him he could hear the earth breathe if he pressed his ear to the cellar door. The boy claimed it sounded like a slow, deep heartbeat. Finch also discovered something that deeply unsettled his scientific mind. While discreetly examining the grounds, he found a patch of soil near the inn's foundation where the vegetation was oddly blighted. The grass was withered and gray, and the wildflowers were twisted into grotesque, unnatural shapes, their petals the color of old bruises. He took a soil sample and noted in his journal that it had a strangely metallic odor and a texture that was abnormally dense and cold to the touch, despite the autumn sun. His most disturbing entry, however, concerned Elias Lawson himself. One evening, Dr. Finch witnessed Elias exit the inn and walk to the edge of the forest. He did not appear to see the doctor watching from a darkened window. Elias knelt down, scooped up a handful of dirt and brought it to his lips. He ate the soil, his movements slow and ritualistic, like a man taking communion. It was a moment of such profound, primitive madness that Dr. Finch felt a cold dread wash over him. This was beyond paranoia. This was a complete surrender to some dark, terrestrial impulse. The master of the Lawson Inn was no longer merely influenced by the land. He was being consumed by it, literally and figuratively. The forbidden folklore of the soil's hunger was playing out before his very eyes. The fragile peace maintained for the benefit of their guest was shattered on Dr. Finch's 8th day at the inn. The catalyst was a sketchbook he found left behind in the lobby. It belonged to Lydia and Samuel. He opened it, expecting to see the crude, childish drawings of a typical 6- and 8-year-old. Instead, the pages were filled with horrifying, macabre images of an almost preternatural skill. Page after page depicted the same scenes, stick figures of their family being pulled down into the earth by skeletal, root-like arms. The house was drawn with a giant, screaming mouth for a door, and on the final Os detailed page was a drawing of their father, but it wasn't Elia's. It was the shadow father. He was depicted as a tall, terrifying figure made of black scribbles, and in his hand he held a long, cruel-looking carving knife. Standing before him were two small figures, Lydia and Samuel, and a woman who could only be Seraphina. This drawing, a child's desperate cry for help, was something Finch could not ignore. He sought out Seraphina, showing her the book. The woman collapsed into a storm of silent, terrified tears. She confessed everything: the whispers, the cellar, the changes in her husband, the children's shadow father. She begged him for help, believing him to be an educated man from the outside world, a man who could reason with the monster her husband had become. Armed with the sketchbook and Seraphina's desperate plea, Dr. Finch decided he had to intervene. He would confront Elias. It was a decision born of compassion and a sense of moral duty, but it would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. He was a man of reason attempting to negotiate with a mind that had been completely colonized by an ancient, unknowable madness. He was about to knock on the door of the asylum, and the chief inmate was about to answer. The confrontation took place in the inn's lobby, the very heart of Elias Lawson's blighted kingdom. Dr. Finch approached him calmly, holding the children's sketchbook. He spoke in measured, rational tones, suggesting that the family's isolation was having a deleterious effect on their mental well-being. He recommended they leave the inn at least for a few weeks to get some fresh air, to see other people. He tried to frame it as a medical concern. Elias listened, his face an unreadable mask. His eyes, however, were not calm. They were two burning coals in the ruin of his face. He let Finch finish his plea, a tense silence hanging in the air. Then he spoke, his voice a low, guttural rasp that was barely human. "You think you know what is happening here," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "You, with your books and your words, you see the surface, the skin of things, but I have been listening to the heart." As he spoke, he took a step forward. "This house is not sick," he continued, his voice rising. "This land is not cursed, it is awake, and it is hungry." The moment Finch held up the sketchbook, showing Elias the drawing of the shadow father, the last vestige of the man's control snapped. With a roar of animalistic fury, Elias lunged. He was shockingly strong. He ripped the journal from Finch's hands, tearing the pages out. He grabbed the doctor by the collar, his fingers digging in like talons, and dragged him towards the front door. "Get out!" he screamed, his face contorted in a mask of pure madness. "Get out of my house! You will not interfere with the compact." He threw Dr. Finch off the porch with terrifying force. The doctor landed hard in the mud, his head striking a rock. Dazed and bleeding, he looked up to see Elias standing in the doorway, a terrifying silhouette against the gloom of the inn. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The Lawson Inn and its inhabitants were now completely sealed off from the outside world. If you find yourself captivated by these dark corners of history, the ones that are deliberately erased, then subscribe to our channel. Because the final, horrifying chapter of the Lawson Inn story is a testament to why some truths are considered too disturbing for the official record. Shaken, bruised, and deeply terrified, Dr. Alastair Finch managed to stumble his way through the woods, eventually finding the main road. He knew he had just escaped a place that was no longer governed by the laws of men. The compact Elias had screamed about, what did it mean? A compact with whom? Or with what? His first instinct was to flee, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that house of horrors. But the faces of Seraphina and her children, their eyes wide with a silent, pleading terror, were burned into his mind. He couldn't just abandon them. His journey led him to the county seat and the office of Deputy Frank Miller. Finch, with his city clothes and frantic, intellectual demeanor, was met with predictable rural skepticism. He recounted the story with as much composure as he could muster: the paranoia, the cellar, the children's drawings, the violent expulsion. He spoke of the soil's hunger legend, trying to explain it as a psychological contagion, a folie à famille exacerbated by extreme isolation. Miller listened patiently, but he was hesitant. Elias Lawson was known to be an odd, severe man, but what Finch was describing sounded like the plot of a penny dreadful novel. In 1904, a man's home was his castle, and the law was reluctant to cross that threshold without clear evidence of a crime. An eccentric and inhospitable innkeeper was not a criminal. Miller promised to check in on the Lawsons in a day or two, a noncommittal assurance designed to placate the agitated doctor. Dr. Finch, frustrated and desperate, knew that a day or two might be an eternity for the family trapped in that inn. He left the deputy's office with a sinking feeling of utter helplessness. He had lit the fuse of Elias' madness and had then been forced to walk away, leaving Seraphina and her children to face the inevitable explosion alone. Back at the inn, the expulsion of Dr. Finch acted as a final, irreversible seal. For Elias, it was confirmation of his deepest paranoias. The outside world was hostile, an enemy to his sacred compact with the land. He was the high priest of a dark, terrestrial faith, and his family were his unwilling acolytes. The atmosphere in the house became suffocating, a vacuum from which all hope had been drained. He boarded up several of the downstairs windows, plunging the inn into a perpetual twilight. He began speaking openly to the house itself, his low, muttering conversations now directed at the walls, the floor, the very air around him. He told it that the unbeliever was gone, that their work could now be completed without interruption. Seraphina and the children became ghosts in their own home. They moved silently from room to room, their communication reduced to fearful glances and hushed whispers when their captor was out of earshot. Meals became a terrifying ritual. Elias would serve them plates of nearly raw meat and wilted vegetables from their blighted garden, watching them with an unnerving intensity as they forced down the unpalatable food. He would speak during these meals, not to them but through them, delivering rambling, incoherent sermons about the cleansing, the return, and the glorious hunger of the soil. He would often stop mid-sentence, cocking his head as if listening to a voice only he could hear, a voice that seemed to emanate from the floor beneath them. During these moments, the children would later tell their mother. They could see the shadow father standing behind him, its smoky tendrils wrapped around his shoulders, whispering secrets directly into his ear. The Lawson family was no longer living in their home, they were interred in it. The cellar, already a place of dread, now became the absolute epicenter of the inn's horror. The scraping and tapping sounds that Seraphina had heard through the floorboards grew louder, more frantic. They would go on for hours, sometimes through the entire night, an unnerving subterranean industry. One afternoon, while Elias was outside, Seraphina's desperation finally overcame her fear. She took a fire poker and worked at the heavy iron padlock on the cellar door, but it was useless. The lock was formidable, a guardian at the gates of her husband's madness. Defeated, she knelt down, pressing her eye to the keyhole, hoping to glimpse what was happening in the forbidden space below. The keyhole was dark, but not completely. A faint, flickering light, likely from a lantern, cast long, dancing shadows. She couldn't see Elias, but she could see the far stone wall. And what she saw made her scramble back, a scream caught in her throat. The wall was covered in carvings. They were complex, labyrinthine patterns like a fusion of twisted roots and arcane symbols. They spiraled out from a central point on the floor, crawling up the walls like a malevolent vine. They were the same disturbing design she had seen in her daughter's sketchbook. Her husband was not just spending his time in the cellar, he was transforming it. He was creating a temple, a ritual space, carving the scripture of his madness directly into the foundation of their home. The chilling realization dawned on her. The sounds she was hearing were not just scraping. It was the sound of her husband, on his hands and knees in the dirt and the dark, meticulously etching the language of the curse into the very bones of the inn. The final days at the Lawson Inn were a descent into a quiet, waking nightmare. Time itself seemed to warp and decay within the boarded-up walls. Elias had now completely abandoned any pretense of his former self. He no longer spoke in coherent sentences, but in a strange, fragmented language of his own invention, a mixture of biblical verses, whispered commands to the Shadow Father, and guttural, earthy sounds. He moved through the darkened halls with a predatory grace, his gaunt frame casting a long, distorted shadow. He stopped eating altogether, sustaining himself only on water from the well, and as Serafina witnessed in horror one night through a crack in the door, handfuls of dirt he kept in a small leather pouch. The house itself seemed to be dying with them. A strange, mold-like substance, dark and velvety, began to creep up the corners of the walls. It had the same coppery, metallic smell that emanated from the cellar. The air grew heavy and cold, and the silence was no longer empty but filled with a tense, vibrating energy, like the moment. Before a lightning strike, Serafina's piety, her last defense, crumbled. Her prayers went unanswered, swallowed by the oppressive malevolence of the inn. She tried to plot an escape, to sneak the children out in the dead of night, but it was impossible. Elias never seemed to sleep. He was always there, always watching, his eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. He was a jailer awaiting a command from a power she could not comprehend. She and her children were no longer his family. They were offerings. They were the final pieces in a horrifying, macabre ritual that was rapidly approaching its unholy crescendo. The compact was almost fulfilled. The soil's hunger was about to be appeased. The night of the final horror began, strangely enough, with an act of what seemed like kindness. It was the 1st of November, a night of deep, penetrating cold. Elias gathered his family in the dining room. His demeanor had changed. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a serene, almost beatific calm that was far more terrifying than his rage. He had washed his face and combed his hair. He wore his finest suit. Spoke to Serafina and the children in a soft, gentle voice, the voice of the husband and father he once was. He told them he was sorry. He said he had been unwell, but that he now understood what needed to be done to make them a whole family again. He told them they were going to have a special dinner, a feast to celebrate their new beginning. He brought out the best silver and the fine china that Serafina had packed away months ago. For a fleeting, desperate moment, she allowed herself to hope. Had the fever broken? Had the madness passed? Was this her Elias returned from the abyss? He told the children to go to their room and put on their Sunday best, and they scurried away, relieved by the sudden shift in the oppressive atmosphere. He then turned to Serafina, his eyes clear and calm. "Everything will be consecrated tonight, my love," he whispered, taking her hand. His skin was as cold as a corpse's. "The land has given me its blessing. We will finally be at peace." The hope in Serafina's heart died instantly, replaced by an icy certainty. This was not a recovery. This was the end. This was the calm that precedes the slaughter. The final act of the curse was about to begin. While Serafina and the children dressed, Elias went down to the cellar for the last time. He did not need the key, for he had removed the padlock earlier that day. The compact was sealed. There was no need for locks anymore. He descended the stone steps into the subterranean world he had created. By the light of a single lantern, the room was a horrifying spectacle. The spiral carvings covered every inch of the walls, pulsing with a dark energy in the flickering light. At the center of the room, where the ancient stones had been, he had dug a shallow, circular depression in the packed earth floor. He had prepared his altar. He knelt beside it, running his hands over the cool, damp soil. He closed his eyes and listened, not with his ears but with his entire being. He listened to the slow, deep heartbeat of the earth that he alone could hear. He listened to the whispers of the Shadow Father, who was no longer a separate entity but a voice that spoke from within his own soul. The instructions were clear, the purpose divine. He was not a murderer, he was a savior. He was rescuing his family from a world of sin and decay, returning them to the pure, eternal embrace of the soil. He was the agent of a power that was ancient, hungry, and absolute. When he ascended the stairs and entered the kitchen, his face was radiant with the certainty of a true believer. He was not just a man anymore. He was an instrument of the earth's will. In his hand, he carried the long, razor-sharp carving knife he used for butchering hogs. Tonight, it would serve a more sacred purpose. The feast Elias had prepared was a grotesque parody of a family meal. At each of the four-place settings in the dimly lit dining room, there was a single, perfect red apple resting on a porcelain plate, nothing else. The symbolism was lost on the children, but for Serafina, it was a chilling testament to her husband's warped, blasphemous state of mind, a final, corrupted supper in their own private Eden. Elias sat at the head of the table, the carving knife laid neatly beside his plate. He instructed them to eat. Lydia and Samuel, eager to please this new, calm version of their father, bit into the crisp fruit. Serafina could not eat. Her throat had closed with terror. She simply stared at her husband, searching his face for any flicker of the man she had loved. She found nothing. There was only a serene, empty vessel. When the children had finished their apples, Elias began to speak. He told them a story. It wasn't a fairy tale, but a strange, rambling narrative about the first family, the family of the soil. He spoke of how they lived in the warm, quiet dark and were fed by the roots of the world. He said that his family, the Lawsons, had been chosen to rejoin them. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice a hypnotic, gentle drone. "It is a great honor. We will be preserved forever. We will feed the land, and in return the land will remember our names." He then stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. He picked up the carving knife. "It is time," he said, his voice filled with a terrifying, paternal love. "Lydia, you are the eldest. You will go first to show Samuel the way." The macabre curse of the Lawson Inn was about to be fulfilled in the most horrifying way imaginable. The full, precise details of what happened next in that dining room died with the Lawson family. But the scene that Deputy Frank Miller would discover 3 days later told a story of methodical, ritualistic horror that defied comprehension. This was not a crime of passion. It was not a frenzied, chaotic slaughter. It was a carefully arranged, macabre work of art, a final, insane offering to a dark god. When Miller pushed open that dining room door, the coppery smell of blood was overwhelming. The scene was bathed in the gray, hazy light filtering through the grimy windows. At the dining table sat 3 figures, perfectly still. Serafina was in her chair, her head slumped forward, her long hair concealing the nature of her death. Across from her, Lydia and Samuel sat upright in their chairs, their hands neatly folded in their laps. They looked like dolls, like perfect porcelain figures in their Sunday best. But their throats had been cut with surgical precision, a single deep slash from ear to. The blood had drained down the front of their clothes, pooling on the floor beneath them in dark, congealing halos. There was no sign of a struggle. It was as if they had accepted their fate, hypnotized by their father's gentle, monstrous words. The most disturbing detail, the one that broke through Miller's professional composure and made him physically ill, was the apples. In the center of the table, the 2 apple cores from the children's final meal had been placed side by side. And next to them was a 3rd apple, untouched. Elias Lawson, the architect of this horror, the 4th member of the family, was nowhere to be seen. The father, the monster, the priest of the soil, had simply vanished. Deputy Miller, reeling from the carnage in the dining room, stumbled back into the lobby, his mind struggling to process the impossible scene. He had to fight the urge to run, to flee the suffocating evil of that house. But he was the law. He had a duty. A man was missing, a murderer. He had to search the premises. His investigation, conducted in a state of adrenaline-fueled dread, revealed more layers to the family's final, insane chapter. Upstairs in the master bedroom, he found Seraphina's Bible open on her nightstand. The pages were stained with her tears. A single passage in the book of Job was underlined in a shaky hand. "For the earth will disclose its blood and will no longer cover its slain." In the children's room, he found the sketchbook. He flipped through the horrifying images of the shadow father and the family being pulled into the earth, his blood running cold. Dr. Finch's story was not the ravings of a madman. It was a tragically accurate prophecy. Every room he entered felt colder than the last. Every shadow seemed to move at the edge of his vision. The entire inn felt like a crypt, a place that had already been claimed by death. His search eventually led him back to the one place he had been subconsciously avoiding, the cellar. The heavy oak door at the back of the kitchen stood ajar, and dark, open maw leading down into the earth. The metallic smell, the scent of blood and damp soil, was stronger here than anywhere else. Miller knew that whatever answers were to be found in this house, they lay down there in the darkness. Taking a deep breath, he lit a lantern, drew his revolver once more, and began his descent into the heart of the Lawson family's madness. The stone steps were slick with a strange, dark moisture. As Deputy Miller descended, the air grew thick and frigid, the silence so profound that he could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. When he reached the bottom and raised his lantern, the light revealed the full, horrifying extent of Elias Lawson's obsession. The cellar was not a storage space. It was a blasphemous cathedral. The spiraling, root-like symbols he had carved covered every surface, seeming to writhe and squirm in the flickering lamplight. They were hypnotic, ancient, and utterly alien. They felt less like human carvings and more like something that had grown there, a fungus of pure insanity. Tools lay scattered on the floor, a chisel, a mallet, several knives of varying sizes, all stained with a mixture of dirt and dried blood. At the very center of the room was the shallow, circular depression that Elias had dug, his unholy altar. And in the center of that depression was the source of the overwhelming smell. It was a pile of something dark and organic. At first, Miller couldn't process what he was seeing. It looked like offal, like the discarded entrails from a slaughterhouse. Then he saw it. A small human hand, unmistakably that of a child. Miller recoiled in horror, his lantern clattering against the stone floor. Elias hadn't just murdered his family, he had desecrated them. In a final, unspeakable act of his macabre faith, he had performed a ritual evisceration, removing parts of his own children and placing them here, at the heart of his temple, as a final, bloody offering to the soil's hunger. He was feeding the land, just as the forbidden legend had described. The discovery in the cellar broke something in Deputy Miller. The methodical, ritualistic nature of the horror was something no amount of training could have prepared him for. This wasn't just a murder, it was an act of profound theological madness. He backed away from the altar of earth and viscera, his mind screaming. He had to get out. He had to bring back help. He had to burn this place to the ground. As he turned to flee up the stairs, his lantern light cast across a small wooden chest tucked away in a dark corner, a chest he hadn't noticed before. Unlike everything else in the cellar, it was clean, free of dust and blood. Driven by some final, morbid compulsion, he approached it. It was unlocked. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a single object, a leather-bound book. It was not a Bible or a ledger. The cover was blank. He opened it. The pages were filled with Elias Lawson's handwriting, a cramped, frantic scrawl that devolved into near incoherence towards the end. It was a diary, a confession, a testament. It was the complete, unfiltered chronicle of his descent into madness. Miller began to read, standing there in the cold, fetid air of the cellar, the lantern light shaking in his hand. He read of Elias first hearing the whispers from the earth. He read of the Shadow Father's promises of eternity and peace. He read of the compact he had made, the lives of his family in exchange for becoming one with the land. The final entry, written on the morning of the murders, was chillingly calm and lucid. "The soil is prepared," it read. "The fruit is ripe for the harvest. Tonight I make my family eternal. I will feed the roots, and we will live forever in the quiet, dark peace of the earth. It is a thing of beauty, a thing of love." If you're finding this exploration into hidden, macabre history compelling, take a moment to hit the like button and let us know in the comments what you think happened to Elias Lawson. Your engagement helps us unearth more of these forbidden stories that have been deliberately erased from our past. The diary of Elias Lawson was a roadmap to insanity, but it was also a crucial piece of evidence. It explained the why, if not in a way that any sane mind could comprehend. But it did not solve the most pressing mystery. Where was Elias? He had arranged his dead family, performed his ghastly ritual in the cellar, and then, according to all evidence, had simply vanished into thin air. A manhunt was organized, the largest Carroll County had ever seen. Posses of grim-faced men armed with rifles and lanterns scoured the dense, unforgiving wilderness of the Ozarks. They searched for days, then weeks. They found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of a campfire. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. The official theory, the one that allowed the townsfolk to sleep at night, was that Elias had fled, perhaps heading west to lose himself in the frontier. But the men who had seen the inn, who had stepped inside that house of horrors, didn't believe it. They had felt the oppressive, ancient energy of the place. They knew that Elias Lawson hadn't just run away. His final diary entry spoke of becoming one with the land. The local old-timers who had warned him from the beginning had their own theory. They said the soil's hunger, having received its payment in blood, had taken the priest as its final prize. They said he hadn't run from the woods. He had run into them, called to a final, unholy union. They believed he was still out there, not as a man, but as a part of the blighted land itself, a ghost in the trees, a whisper on the wind. The Lawson Inn did not stand for long after the discovery of the massacre. The place was deemed unholy by the community, a cancer on the landscape. No one would go near it, not even the law. Deputy Miller, profoundly traumatized by what he had seen, refused to set foot on the property again. The story of the Macabre murders and the horrifying discoveries in the cellar became a banned topic in polite society, but a feverish source of hushed, terrified whispers in private. The official report, penned by a county clerk who had never visited the site, was a masterpiece of deliberate obfuscation. It recorded the event as a simple, tragic murder-suicide, citing religious mania as the cause. It made no mention of the ritualistic arrangement of the bodies, the carvings in the cellar, the eviscerated remains, or the mad diary of Elias Lawson. The journal of Dr. Alastair Finch, which he had submitted as evidence, was conveniently lost in a records fire a year later. The true, disturbing nature of the crime was systematically scrubbed from the official history. About a month after the murders, a group of local men, their identities forever kept secret, rode out to the inn in the dead of night. They acted without official sanction, driven by a primal need to cleanse the land. They doused the cursed structure in kerosene and set it ablaze. The Lawson Inn burned with an unnatural ferocity, the flames leaping high into the night sky, casting a demonic orange glow that could be seen for miles. They were determined to erase it from the face of the earth, to cauterize the wound it had left on their community. The fire that consumed the Lawson Inn was meant to be an act of purification, a final, violent end to a horrifying chapter in the county's history. But it was not an ending. The land itself, the source of the blight, remained. The ashes of the inn settled into the soil, mingling with the blood that had already soaked into the earth. The story of the Lawsons, despite the official cover-up, refused to die. It evolved, transforming from a news event into a full-blown, terrifying local legend. It became a ghost story told around campfires, a cautionary tale for misbehaving children. People called the hill where the inn had stood Hunger Hill, or Lawson's Blight. They said that on cold November nights, you could still see a faint, ghostly light where the cellar used to be. They claimed you could hear the sound of a woman weeping, or a man whispering secrets to the dirt. Hunters and trappers who strayed too close to the area reported a feeling of profound dread, of being watched by unseen eyes. Their compasses would spin wildly, and their animals would become agitated and refuse to go further. The land was marked, shunned by man and beast alike. The curse, it seemed, had not been vanquished by the fire. The fire had merely consumed the vessel. The malevolent consciousness within the earth, the soil's hunger, was still there, dormant perhaps, but waiting. The macabre tale became a piece of forbidden history, a dark stain on the soul of the Ozarks that could be covered up, but never truly washed away. What then became of Elias Lawson? The mystery of his disappearance tormented the region for years, becoming as much a part of the legend as the murders themselves. The official case file remained open, a cold case gathering dust in a forgotten corner of the county clerk's office. But 6 weeks after the fire, a discovery was made that added a final, horrifying postscript to the saga. A pair of fur trappers working a line nearly 20 miles from the site of the former inn found something snagged in a thorny thicket near a creek bed. It was the tattered remains of a man's suit coat, the fabric rotted and torn. In the pocket, they found a small, rust-stained silver locket. Inside were two tiny, faded portraits, a woman and two small children. It was Seraphina, Lydia, and Samuel. A few yards away, deeper in the thicket, they found him, or what was left of him. The body of Elias Lawson was wedged between two large rocks, but the condition of the corpse was what made the trappers retch. He was not decomposed in a way that suggested 6 weeks of exposure to the elements. He was desiccated. His flesh was drawn tight against his bones, his skin the texture of brittle parchment. He looked like a mummy, an ancient corpse that had been dried out over centuries. There was no sign of animal predation, no wounds other than the scratches from the thorns. The county coroner, a man of limited medical training, was baffled. In his report, he listed the cause of death as starvation and exposure, but he noted privately that it looked as if every ounce of fluid, every drop of blood, had been systematically drained from the body, as if something had used him as a husk and then discarded him. The discovery of Elias Lawson's bizarrely desiccated body only deepened the macabre mystery. For the rational mind, it was a strange anomaly, an unexplained medical curiosity. For those who knew the forbidden folklore, it was the final, terrifying confirmation of the curse. The legend of the soil's hunger didn't just speak of madness and blood sacrifice. The oldest, darkest versions of the tale whispered of what happened to the chosen instrument after the ritual was complete. They said the land, having been fed, would then consume its priest. It would draw the life force out of him, pulling the blood and water from his body back into the soil from which it came, a final act of horrifying communion. Elias Lawson, in His madness, had believed he would become one with the land, that he would achieve a kind of terrestrial immortality. In a way, the legend suggested he had gotten his wish. His physical body was found miles away, but his essence, his life force, had been reabsorbed by the blighted hill where he had built his monument to ambition. He had fed the hunger, and then the hunger had fed on him. This disturbing aspect of the story ensured that the legend would never die. It provided a supernatural, symmetrical, and utterly horrifying conclusion. The official history would remember Elias Lawson as a madman who murdered his family and died a fugitive in the wilderness. But the forbidden history, the one whispered in the dark, remembered him as the willing victim of a curse, a man who made a compact with a hungry earth and paid the ultimate price. Looking back at the tragedy of the Lawson Inn through the lens of modern psychology, it is easy to construct a rational explanation. One could diagnose Elias Lawson with a severe psychotic disorder, perhaps paranoid schizophrenia, triggered or exacerbated by extreme stress and isolation. The curse could be reinterpreted as a shared psychotic disorder, or aphasia, where his delusions were transmitted to his wife and children. The whispers, the shadow father, the belief that the land was speaking to him, all could be seen as symptoms of a mind collapsing under its own weight. The isolation of the Ozark wilderness, the financial pressure of the failing inn, and the cultural superstitions of the region could have created a perfect storm for a catastrophic mental breakdown. In this interpretation, the story is not one of supernatural horror, but of a tragic and ultimately preventable failure of mental health care on the lonely, unforgiving American frontier. Elias was not a monster, but a sick man, and his family were not sacrificial offerings, but the victims of his untreated illness. This explanation is clean. It is logical. It fits neatly into our 21st century understanding of the world. It dismisses the supernatural and grounds the horror in the tangible, in the dark, uncharted territories of the human brain. But for some, this explanation feels incomplete. It feels too simple. It doesn't account for the sheer methodical, ritualistic nature of the crime, the strange carvings, the blighted soil, or the bizarre, desiccated condition of Lawson's body. It doesn't explain the cold. The alternate explanation, the one that history has tried so hard to forget, is far more disturbing. It is the possibility that the curse was real. That in certain, forgotten places of the world there exists an intelligence, an ancient consciousness tied to the land itself. A genius loci that is not benevolent but possessive, territorial, and deeply malevolent when disturbed. In this view, Lawson was not merely insane. He was influenced, possessed, his mind systematically hijacked by an outside force. The soil's hunger was not a metaphor for his madness, but a literal description of a parasitic terrestrial entity. This explanation posits that the stones Elias removed were not just rocks. They were a seal, a ward placed there by earlier inhabitants who understood the true nature of the land and sought to contain it. By breaking that seal and digging his foundation into the heart of its power, Elias exposed himself and his family to its venomous influence. The entity offered him what he craved most, a sense of purpose, of power, of a grand, cosmic importance. It fed his ego while it poisoned his soul, twisting his ambition into a mandate for murder. This version of the story suggests that the true horror of the Lawson Inn was not psychological, but elemental. It places humanity not at the top of the food chain, but as a potential source of nourishment for things much older and hungrier than ourselves. It is a deeply unsettling thought, one that challenges our most basic assumptions about the world we inhabit. It suggests that some places are simply, irredeemably evil, and that some doors are banned for a very good reason. The legacy of the Lawson Inn is one of silence and shadow. After the fire, the land was seized by the county for unpaid taxes and then sold at auction for a pittance. The new owner, a man from out of state, had plans to log the timber, but his crews refused to work there. They complained of equipment malfunctions, sudden illnesses, and a pervasive, unnerving feeling of being watched. After a series of inexplicable accidents, the project was abandoned. The land was left to nature. Over the decades, the forest has reclaimed what was once a scar on its landscape. A thick, impenetrable growth of thorny vines and tangled brush has covered the old foundation. Unless you knew exactly where to look, you would never know that a house of such profound horror once stood there. Yet, the land remains different. Locals who dare to venture near the edge of the property say the area is unnaturally quiet. There are no bird songs, no insect noises. The silence is absolute, as if the land itself is holding its breath. The trees that grow there are stunted and twisted, their branches reaching down towards the earth like grasping fingers. The soil remains dark and cold, even in the height of summer. The memory of the blood it was fed seems to have permanently altered its chemistry. The curse, it would appear, is patient. It has outlasted the Lawsons, the fire, and the generations of storytellers. It remains embedded in the earth, a dark, sleeping secret in the heart of the Ozarks. Today, the story of the Lawson Inn is little more than a whisper, a piece of dark folklore known only to a handful of local historians and enthusiasts of the macabre. You will not find it in the official histories of Carroll County. You will not read about it in textbooks about the American frontier. The methodical erasure that began with a falsified coroner's report has been largely successful. The banned history of the inn has been driven so far underground that it borders on non-existence. But the evidence, for those who know how to look, still lingers. The journal of Dr. Alastair Finch, thought to be lost, is rumored to have survived. Legend says a copy was made by a clerk before the original was destroyed, and that it sits in a private collection somewhere, a first-hand account of the encroaching madness. Deputy Miller's unofficial case notes, filled with the horrifying details he was forced to omit from his public report, are said to have been passed down through his family, a secret inheritance of trauma and truth. And then there are the carvings. Rumor has it that one of the men who burned down the inn managed to pry a single stone from the cellar wall before the fire was set. The stone, covered in Lawson's strange, root-like symbols, is said to be kept in a locked box, cold to the touch, a physical remnant of a madman's unholy scripture. These are the last fading echoes of a horrifying truth, a truth that suggests our world is far stranger and far more dangerous than we are comfortable believing. The tale of the Lawson Inn serves as a chilling, macabre reminder of the darkness that can lie just beneath the surface of our perceived reality. Was it a case of psychological collapse, a tragedy born of isolation and mental illness? Or was it a genuine supernatural event, a horrifying encounter with an ancient, malevolent force of nature? The truth, most likely, lies somewhere in the murky, indistinguishable space between the two. Perhaps the land itself was not evil, but simply possessed a strange, ambient energy, a psychological resonance that acted as a powerful catalyst for Lawson's latent madness. Perhaps his mind, already predisposed to paranoia and obsession, found in the local folklore a ready-made framework upon which to build his terrifying delusions. In this synthesis, the curse and the madness were not separate forces, but two parts of a horrifying, symbiotic relationship. The land provided the suggestion, the seed of horror, and Elias' mind nurtured it, cultivated it, and brought it to its bloody, terrible fruition. He was not a puppet, but a willing collaborator, a man who heard a faint, dark whisper from the earth and chose to answer its call, amplifying it until it became the only sound he could hear. This interpretation is, in many ways, the most disturbing of all. It suggests that the greatest monsters are not external forces that attack us, but the ones we invite inside, the ones we choose to feed. It implies that the soil's hunger is not just a legend from 1904 Arkansas, but a timeless metaphor for the darkness that lies dormant within the human heart, waiting for the right conditions, the right place, the right time to be awakened. In the end, we are left with more questions than answers. We are left with the ghost of a story, a horrifying event that has been deliberately pushed to the fringes of history. We are left with the chilling image of a family sitting down to a final, macabre supper. We are left with the mystery of strange carvings in a dark cellar and the desiccated corpse of a man who believed he was making a compact with the earth. The story of the Lawson Inn is a cold case in the truest sense of the word. The trail of evidence has been obscured by time, fire, and a concerted effort to forget. All that remains is the legend, a dark jewel of American Gothic horror. It is a story that reminds us that the wilderness of the past is not so different from the wilderness of the human soul. Both have dark, unexplored corners where forgotten things still lurk. Both have places that are best left undisturbed. The hill where the Lawson Inn once stood is still there, silent and shrouded in the Ozark mist. The land keeps its secrets. The soil's hunger, whether real or imagined, was appeased once, and as the forest grows over the ashes and the memory of the Lawson fades to nothing, the cold, dark earth waits, a patient, horrifying testament to a curse that was powerful enough to be banned from history, but too terrifying to ever be truly forgotten.